Spring, 1818. Ashford Manor stood resplendent under a canopy of stars, its windows blazing with candlelight that spilled onto manicured lawns where carriages deposited England's finest. Inside, the ballroom thrummed with music and laughter, a celebration of triumph. Lady Georgiana Ashford, the youngest and prettiest of the family's daughters, had just married Viscount Bramwell. It was the second brilliant match in 6 months, following her sister, Louisa's union with the Earl of Hartley. The Ashford name had never shone brighter. Lavinia Rose Ashford stood in the shadows near the refreshment table, a shawl draped over each arm and another clutched in her hands. At 29, she had long ago accepted her role as the family's invisible fixture, too old to be marriageable, too poor to be desirable, too useful to be entirely dismissed. She watched her aunt, Lady Constance, glide through the crowd like a peacock in emerald silk, basking in the glory of her daughter's successes. No one looked at Lavinia. They never did. "My dear Lady Rothmore," Lady Constance's voice carried across the room, sharp with practised delight. "Allow me to present my nieces, all of them married so advantageously now. Well, all who matter, at any rate." Lavinia's fingers tightened on the shawl. She stood less than 10 feet away, close enough to hear every word, close enough to be included in any reasonable definition of all. But Lady Constance's gaze swept past her, as if she were part of the wallpaper, just another decorative element in the room's design. "How wonderful," Lady Rothmore cooed. "You must be so proud." "Indeed, though I confess securing proper matches requires such careful management. One cannot simply throw young ladies at society and hope for the best." Lady Constance's laugh tinkled like breaking glass. "Some girls, you understand, are simply meant to serve rather than shine." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of knowing glances toward Lavinia. A few guests smirked. Most simply looked away, already forgetting she existed. Heat crept up Lavinia's neck, but she kept her face carefully neutral. Years of practice had taught her to absorb humiliation, like a sponge absorbs water, silently, invisibly, without making a fuss. She turned toward the hallway, needing escape more than air. "Miss Ashford." A footman appeared at her elbow, looking harried. "Lady Constance requires you to check on the cloakroom. Some guests are complaining about misplaced items." "Of course," Lavinia murmured. She made her way through the crowd, a ghost among the living, still carrying those damned shawls, because no one had remembered to take them from her. The music swelled, a waltz, beautiful and bright, and couples swirled past her like water around a stone. She caught a glimpse of Georgiana in her new husband's arms, radiant with joy and youth and a future stretching golden before her. Lavinia remembered being 19 once. She remembered believing that she too might dance at her own wedding ball someday. The memory tasted bitter now. She slipped past the cloakroom, which required no attention whatsoever, as she'd suspected, and found herself in the long corridor leading to her uncle's library. The sounds of the ball faded behind her, muffled by thick doors and thicker carpets. Here at last she could breathe. The library door stood slightly ajar, lamplight spilling through the gap. Lavinia hesitated. Her uncle rarely allowed anyone in his sanctuary, but surely he wouldn't mind if she simply sat for a moment, just long enough to compose herself before returning to her duties. She pushed the door open and froze. A man stood by the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him as he gazed out at the moonlit gardens. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in evening clothes that spoke of wealth and taste. Dark hair curled slightly at his collar. Something about his posture suggested he, too, had sought refuge from the glittering chaos beyond. "I'm sorry," Lavinia said quickly, already retreating. "I didn't realize..." Please. He turned, and she caught her breath. He was beautiful in the way classical sculptures were beautiful. Strong features, intelligent eyes, a mouth that looked as if it rarely smiled, but might be devastating when it did. Don't leave on my account. I'm the interloper here. His voice held the faintest trace of an accent, something continental that softened his vowels and added music to his consonants. I shouldn't disturb you, Lavinia said, even as her feet remained stubbornly planted. Something about him made her reluctant to return to that ballroom, to the shawls and the invisibility, and Lady Constance's casual cruelty. You're not disturbing me. Quite the opposite. He gestured to the room. I was attempting to remember what silence sounds like. The ballroom is rather enthusiastic. Despite herself, Lavinia felt her lips twitch. Enthusiastic. That's a diplomatic word for it. I'm occasionally diplomatic. He moved away from the window, and lamplight caught his features more clearly. Mid-30s, she guessed, with eyes that had seen too much and a wariness that matched her own. Though I confess I'm more often simply tired of performance. Are you tired of it too? The question was so unexpected, so direct, that Lavinia found herself answering honestly. I'm not usually part of the performance. I'm more of a stagehand. Ah, understanding flickered in his expression. The ones who make everything work but receive none of the applause. Something like that. He studied her for a moment, not with the dismissive glance she was accustomed to, but with genuine interest. It made her uncomfortable and oddly warm at the same time. I'm Beaumont, he said finally. Alistair Beaumont. Lavinia Ashford. Ashford? His eyebrow rose slightly. Then your family to the bride? Cousin. She hesitated, then added, though not the sort of cousin who gets introduced to important guests. I'm the spinster relative who carries shawls and manages cloakrooms. She hadn't meant to say that. The words simply spilled out, bitter and honest in a way she never allowed herself to be. Perhaps it was the safety of speaking to a stranger, someone who would disappear back into the crowd and forget her existence by morning. But Beaumont didn't laugh or look uncomfortable. Instead, he tilted his head, considering. I find that people who carry shawls often see more than those who wear them. Observation is a gift, even if society treats it as a burden. Something in Lavinia's chest loosened, just slightly. That's a kind way of putting it. I'm occasionally kind. The corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but close. Though more often I'm simply honest, which people frequently mistake for rudeness. I think I prefer honesty. Then I'll be honest. I came to this ball because refusing would have been unforgivably rude, but I've been counting the minutes until I could leave without causing offence. The problem is, I've lost count at least 3 times. Lavinia surprised herself by laughing, a real laugh that bubbled up unbidden. I stopped counting years ago. Now I simply endure. That sounds exhausting. It is. She looked down at the shawl still draped over her arms, suddenly aware of how ridiculous she must look. I should return these to their owners. People will be leaving soon, and there will be chaos if they can't find their things. Will anyone notice if you take 5 more minutes? The question hung in the air between them. Lavinia knew she should say no, should excuse herself and return to her duties, like the obedient, invisible creature everyone expected her to be. But this man, this stranger, had listened to her, had seen her, and she found herself desperately unwilling to let go of that feeling quite yet. Probably not, she admitted. Then tell me, Lavinia Ashford? Her name on his lips sent an odd shiver through her. If you could be anywhere but here, where would you be? It was a frivolous question, the sort of thing people asked at parties without expecting real answers. But the way he asked it, with those steady eyes and that genuine interest, made her want to answer truly. Paris, she said before she could think better of it. I've always wanted to see Paris. The art, the architecture, the way everyone describes the light there. I've read about it so many times I feel as if I could navigate the streets in my sleep. But I've never left England, never even left this county, actually. Paris is beautiful, Beaumont said softly, especially in spring, when the chestnuts bloom along the Seine. The light really is different there, softer somehow, more golden. Though I think you'd find it's the people who make a place alive, not the buildings. You've been? I lived there for several years. Something shadowed his expression. Before circumstances changed. Lavinia wanted to ask more, but footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. Heavy, hurried footsteps that she recognised immediately. Miss Ashford. The housekeeper's voice rang with reproach. Lady Constance is looking for you. The guests are leaving and you're needed immediately. The spell broke. Reality came crashing back. The shawls, the duties, the invisible life waiting beyond the library door. I have to go, Lavinia said, already moving toward the hallway. Then she paused, glancing back at the man who'd given her 5 minutes of feeling seen. Thank you for the conversation, Mr. Beaumont. It was kind of you. The kindness was yours, he replied, but she was already gone, swept back into the current of other people's needs and expectations. She didn't see the way he watched her leave, or the thoughtful expression that settled on his face. She didn't know that Alistair Beaumont, Duc de Valcourt, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Europe, stood in that library for 10 more minutes, thinking about a woman who carried shawls and dreamed of Paris. Lavinia returned to the ballroom, slipped back into her role like putting on a familiar coat. She distributed shawls, summoned carriages, and ensured Lady Constance's guests departed with the same efficiency they'd arrived. No one thanked her. No one noticed. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lavinia went to bed that night with something besides resignation in her heart. It was small, fragile, probably foolish, but it was there nonetheless. A memory of being seen, of being heard, of 5 minutes when she'd been a person instead of a shadow. She didn't dare call it hope. Hope was dangerous for women like her, but it was something. If you're enjoying Lavinia's journey from invisible to unforgettable, subscribe to our channel for more stories of overlooked heroines who capture the hearts of England's most powerful lords. New historical romances every week. 3 days passed before Alistair Beaumont returned to Ashford Manor. Lavinia was in the morning room when the butler announced him, struggling to untangle embroidery thread that her youngest cousin had somehow knotted into an impossible mess. Her fingers stilled at the name. Surely she'd misheard. Why would a gentleman like Mr. Beaumont return? He'd paid his respects at the wedding ball. There was no social obligation to visit the family again. "Show him to the drawing-room," Lady Constance commanded, her voice pitched high with excitement. "Girls! Quickly! Louisa, fix your hair. Georgiana, you must change that dress immediately. The blue silk, I think. Lavinia, take that dreadful embroidery somewhere else. You're not to be seen." "But, Aunt, Did I stutter?" Lady Constance's eyes flashed with warning. "Go. Wait in the kitchen if you must. I'll send for you when you're needed." Lavinia fled, but not to the kitchen. She found herself in the conservatory, a glass-roofed room filled with plants that her late uncle had collected from around the world. It was her favourite hiding place, warm and green and blessedly quiet. Through the windows, she could see the drawing room across the courtyard. If she angled herself just right behind the potted palms, she could watch without being seen. She told herself she wasn't curious about Mr. Beaumont. She told herself she'd simply come here to finish the embroidery in peace. She was lying, and she knew it. Through the window, she watched him enter the drawing room, with Lady Constance fluttering around him like an anxious bird. Her cousins appeared moments later, both looking picture-perfect in their finest day dresses. Georgiana still wore her new wedding ring, and she kept twisting it on her finger, a habit that betrayed nervousness despite her confident smile. Lavinia couldn't hear the conversation, but she could read the body language easily enough. Lady Constance gestured expansively, no doubt regaling their guest with tales of her daughter's accomplishments. Georgiana and Louisa sat with practised grace, saying just enough to seem engaged, but not so much as to appear forward. It was a performance Lavinia had witnessed 100 times, though she'd never been cast in anything but a supporting role. What surprised her was Mr. Beaumont's reaction. He was polite, impeccably so, but there was a quality to his attention that struck her as distant. He nodded at appropriate moments, smiled when expected, but his eyes kept drifting toward the door as if he were waiting for something. Or someone. "Miss Lavinia?" She jumped, nearly dropping the embroidery. The footman, young Thomas, stood in the conservatory doorway, looking apologetic. "Forgive me, miss. Didn't mean to startle you. Lady Constance requires tea service in the drawing room. She says you're to prepare the tray and bring it in yourself." Of course she did. Lady Constance never missed an opportunity to remind Lavinia of her place, especially when there were witnesses to observe the hierarchy. "I'll be there directly," Lavinia said, setting aside the embroidery with hands that trembled slightly. She had no reason to feel nervous. She'd served tea 1,000 times. The fact that Mr. Beaumont would be there made no difference whatsoever, but her hands shook anyway as she arranged the best china on a silver tray, as she checked the temperature of the water and measured the tea leaves with extra care. She smoothed her dress, a simple grey morning gown that made her look like what she was, a spinster relative past her prime, and tried to calm the absurd flutter in her chest. When she entered the drawing room, balancing the heavy tray with practised ease, no one looked at her. Lady Constance was mid-sentence, describing Georgiana's wedding breakfast with the kind of detail that suggested she expected to be interrupted and praised at any moment. And the Duke of Somerset himself commented on the floral arrangements. I told him, "Your Grace, only the finest for my Georgiana," and he quite agreed that... "Ah," Mr. Beaumont's voice cut smoothly through the monologue. "Miss Ashford." Every head in the room turned. Lavinia froze halfway to the tea table, the tray suddenly feeling twice as heavy. She realised with a sinking sensation that she'd assumed he wouldn't remember her. Why would he? She was no one, and he was, well, whoever he was. Someone important enough that Lady Constance had practically fainted with excitement at his card. But he was looking at her now with recognition clear in his eyes, and something that might have been pleasure. "Mr. Beaumont," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I wondered if I might see you again," he said, as if this were a perfectly normal thing to announce in the middle of Lady Constance's drawing room. "I hope you recovered those shawls safely the other evening." Lavinia set the tray down before she could drop it. "I did, thank you." "Miss Ashford, you may pour," Lady Constance interjected sharply, her smile strained. "And then you may be excused. I'm sure you have duties elsewhere." "Actually," Beaumont said, still looking at Lavinia, "I was hoping Miss Ashford might join us." I find myself curious about her thoughts on a matter we were discussing. The silence that followed could have frozen wine in its bottle. Lady Constance's face went through several remarkable transformations before settling on an expression of pained confusion. Georgiana and Louisa exchanged bewildered glances. Lavinia felt heat creep up her neck. "I'm certain my niece has nothing of interest to contribute," Lady Constance said with a brittle laugh. "She's not been out in society, you understand? Rather sheltered. Her opinions would hardly be— On the contrary, I find that those who observe society from the edges often have the clearest view of it." Beaumont's tone remained pleasant, but there was steel underneath. "Miss Ashford, we were discussing whether the current fashion for Gothic novels represents a decline in literary taste or merely an evolution. You mentioned the other evening that you're an avid reader. What's your opinion?" It was a trap, Lavinia realised. Not for her, for Lady Constance. If her aunt refused to let her answer, she'd be openly rude to a guest. If she allowed it, she'd be forced to acknowledge Lavinia as someone whose opinions mattered. Lavinia decided to make the choice herself. "I think," she said carefully, pouring tea with hands that had stopped trembling, "that fashion in literature is like fashion in dress. It changes, but the underlying desire for well-crafted stories remains constant. Gothic novels may seem sensational, but they explore genuine emotions. Fear, isolation, the feeling of being trapped in circumstances beyond your control. Those are universal experiences, regardless of whether they're dressed up in crumbling castles and mysterious villains." She handed Mr. Beaumont his cup, allowing herself to meet his eyes briefly. He looked satisfied, as if she'd passed some kind of test. "Exactly so," he said. "I quite agree. In fact, I'd argue that the best Gothic novels are really about transformation, characters finding strength they didn't know they possessed, escaping circumstances that seemed inescapable." "Perhaps that's why they're so popular," Lavinia heard herself say. "Everyone wants to believe that escape is possible." "And don't you believe it is?" The question was quiet, but it struck her like a bell. Did she believe escape was possible? Or had she given up on that dream years ago, resigned herself to carrying shawls and being invisible until she died? "I think," she said slowly, aware that the entire room was now hanging on her words, "that it depends on whether you're the protagonist or merely a supporting character in someone else's story." Something flashed in Beaumont's eyes, understanding, perhaps, or recognition. "And which are you, Miss Ashford?" "I'm the lady with the tea," she said, forcing lightness into her tone. "Every story needs one." He smiled then, really smiled, and it transformed his face completely. "Perhaps you're reading the wrong story." Lady Constance cleared her throat with the subtlety of a cannon blast. "How fascinating! Lavinia, you really must check on dinner preparations. Cook was quite unclear about tonight's menu, and I need you to sort it out." It was a dismissal dressed as a duty, and they all knew it. Lavinia set down the teapot and curtsied slightly. "Of course, Aunt. Excuse me?" She left the drawing room with as much dignity as she could muster, but she felt Beaumont's gaze on her back until she turned the corner. Only then did she allow herself to breathe fully, leaning against the corridor wall and pressing her hands to her flushed cheeks. What on earth was happening? The answer came 3 days later, when Mr. Beaumont returned again. And then 2 days after that. And then the day following. Each time he managed to engage Lavinia in conversation, despite Lady Constance's increasingly desperate attempts to monopolise his attention. Each time he asked her questions about books, about music, about her thoughts on everything from architecture to agriculture, and listened to her answers as if they mattered. On his 4th visit, he arrived with a book tucked under his arm. "I thought you might enjoy this," he said, handing it to her when Lady Constance was distracted by a footman's interruption. It's a first-hand account of Paris by an Englishwoman who lived there before the Revolution. I remembered you mentioned wanting to see the city. Lavinia stared at the leather-bound volume, her throat tight. I couldn't possibly accept. It's a loan, not a gift, he said quickly. I'd value your opinion on it. The author has a sharp wit and a keen eye for detail. Rather reminds me of you, actually. Their fingers brushed as she took the book, and she felt that small touch like lightning through her veins. Thank you, she whispered. The pleasure, he said quietly, is entirely mine. It was Maggie Thornton who finally forced Lavinia to acknowledge what was happening. He's courting you, you blind fool, her friend said bluntly over tea in her cosy drawing room. Maggie was a widow of 10 years, comfortable in her independence and refreshingly direct in all things. That man is courting you as surely as I'm sitting here drinking tea that's far too weak. Don't be ridiculous. Lavinia set her cup down with more force than necessary. Men like Mr. Beaumont don't court women like me. He's simply being kind. Kind? Maggie snorted. Lavinia, the man has visited Ashford Manor 6 times in 2 weeks. He brings you books. He asks your opinion on everything under the sun. He looks at you like you're the only person in the room. That's not kindness, darling. That's interest. He barely knows me. So, he's trying to know you better? That's rather the point of courting, isn't it? Lavinia shook her head, feeling panic rise in her chest. You don't understand. I'm 29 years old. I have no dowry, no prospects, no dash. No patience for nonsense, apparently. Maggie leaned forward, her expression softening. Listen to me. I've watched you make yourself invisible for years, and I've said nothing because you seemed content enough. But this man sees you, Lavinia. He sees you the way you deserve to be seen. And you're terrified. I'm not. You are. Because if you let yourself hope, and if it goes wrong, it will hurt more than all these years of resignation put together. Maggie reached across the table and gripped her hand. But what if it goes right? Lavinia couldn't answer. The possibility seemed too fragile to speak aloud, too dangerous to examine in the light. But that evening, when she returned to Ashford Manor, she found herself reading the book Mr. Beaumont had lent her. The author's voice was indeed witty and observant, bringing Paris to life with such vivid detail that Lavinia could almost smell the bread baking in the boulangeries, almost hear the bells of Notre Dame ringing across the city. On the last page, tucked between the final leaf and the back cover, she found a note in elegant handwriting. I should very much like to show you Paris someday. Not the Paris of guidebooks and tourist attractions, but the real city, the hidden gardens, the quiet cafes, the bookstalls along the Seine. I think you would love it as much as I do. Eh bien, Lavinia read the note 3 times, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then she carefully tucked it back into the book and pressed the volume to her chest, allowing herself, just for a moment, to imagine it. To imagine leaving Ashford Manor and her life of invisible servitude. To imagine Paris with a man who saw her, really saw her, when everyone else looked through her like glass. The imagination felt like madness. It felt like hope. It felt like the most dangerous thing she'd ever allowed herself to feel. The formal dinner came a week later, one of Lady Constance's elaborate affairs designed to showcase the family's elevated status. Every detail was choreographed to perfection. The menu, the guest list, the seating arrangements. Naturally, Lavinia was seated far from the main table, tucked between an elderly baronet who was quite deaf, and a middle-aged gentleman more interested in his wine than conversation. Mr. Beaumont, she'd learned by now that he was actually a duke, Duke de Valcourt, which explained Lady Constance's near-hysterical delight at his continued visits. Sat at the head table between Georgiana and a beautiful young widow Lady Constance had invited specifically to catch his attention. Lavinia told herself it didn't matter. Told herself she had no claim on him. No right to feel the sharp twist of jealousy when he smiled politely at something the widow said. She was doing exactly what Maggie had warned against, allowing herself to hope, to imagine, to want something she could never have. She was picking at her fish course, trying to appear engaged with the deaf baronet's shouted observations about the weather, when a footman appeared at her elbow. "Miss Ashford," he murmured, "His Grace requests your presence at the main table. Lady Constance has taken ill and wishes you to act as hostess in her stead." Lavinia blinked. Lady Constance looked perfectly healthy from where she sat, cheeks flushed with wine and animation. But the footman's expression was carefully neutral, and she realised with a start that this was Mr. Beaumont's doing somehow. He'd engineered this. She moved to the main table on trembling legs, taking the empty seat that had somehow materialised beside the Duke. Lady Constance looked apoplectic, but couldn't protest without causing a scene. "Thank you for joining us, Miss Ashford," Mr. Beaumont said, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "I was just telling Lady Rothmore about the restoration work being done at Versailles. I thought you might find it interesting, given your love of architecture." And just like that, he drew her into the conversation at the head table, not as an afterthought or a courtesy, but as someone whose opinion mattered. When she mentioned something she'd read about Gothic cathedrals, he listened intently. When she made a quiet observation about the mathematical precision of Baroque design, he built on her thought and credited her with the insight. For the first time in her life, Lavinia sat at the table that mattered. She was seen. She was heard. She was valued. It was intoxicating. It was terrifying. It couldn't possibly last. The evening ended with guests departing into the cool spring night. Lavinia lingered in the shadows of the entrance hall, saying goodbye to no one because no one said goodbye to her. She watched Mr. Beaumont take his leave of Lady Constance, watched him climb into his elegant carriage, watched the horses pull away into the darkness. She thought that was the end of it, thought she'd return to her room and her invisible life and try to forget what it felt like to be seen for one perfect evening. But as she turned to go upstairs, she saw something white on the hall table. An envelope, addressed in that elegant handwriting she'd come to recognise. Inside was a single line. "Meet me in the garden tomorrow at dawn. I have something to ask you." A B. Lavinia stood in the empty hall, holding that note, her heart racing so fast she thought it might burst from her chest. Every sensible part of her mind screamed warnings. This was dangerous. This was impossible. This would end in heartbreak. But she knew with absolute certainty that she would be in that garden at dawn. Because Maggie was right. She was terrified, and she was going anyway. Lavinia barely slept. She lay in her narrow bed in the servants' wing, because of course Lady Constance housed her with the staff rather than the family, watching the square of window slowly lighten from black to grey to the pale gold of early dawn. Her mind spun with possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. Perhaps he wanted to tell her he was leaving England, that his visits must end. Perhaps he'd realised his attention had been misunderstood and wanted to clarify that he saw her only as a friend, a pleasant conversational companion, nothing more. Perhaps Maggie was right and he wanted... number. Lavinia couldn't let herself complete that thought. The hope would destroy her if she was wrong. She dressed in the pre-dawn darkness, choosing her least shabby day dress, pale blue muslin that had been fashionable 5 years ago. Her hands shook as she pinned her hair, and she had to redo it twice before achieving something presentable. Then she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. Ironic, that, and crept through the silent house like a thief. The garden was silvered with dew and dawn mist. Birds were just beginning their morning songs, and the air smelled of roses and wet earth. Lavinia made her way down the gravel path toward the old fountain at the garden's heart, her half-boots crunching softly on the stones. Mr. Beaumont was already there. He stood beside the fountain, dressed more casually than she'd ever seen him. No cravat, his shirt open at the throat, his dark coat unbuttoned. He looked younger, somehow, less formal, and when he turned at her approach, the expression on his face made her breath catch. "You came," he said, and there was relief in his voice. "I wasn't certain you would—" "I nearly didn't." The honesty escaped before she could stop it. "I spent half the night convincing myself this was a terrible idea." "And the other half?" "Convincing myself it might not be." He smiled at that, but it faded quickly, replaced by something more serious. "I need to tell you the truth, Lavinia. I've been coming to Ashford Manor under false pretenses." Her heart sank. Here it was then, the clarification, the retreat, the inevitable return to invisibility. "I haven't been visiting to pay respects to your family," he continued, taking a step closer. "I haven't been maintaining social obligations or building political connections. I've been coming because from the moment I met you in that library, from the moment you spoke to me like I was simply a man instead of a title, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you." Lavinia's breath left her lungs in a rush. "Mr. Beaumont—" "Alistair," he interrupted gently. "My name is Alistair, and I would very much like you to use it." "Alistair." His name felt strange and wonderful on her tongue. "I don't understand. You're a duke. You could have anyone—" "I don't want anyone." He closed the distance between them, stopping just short of impropriety. "I want you. Your sharp wit, your kind heart, the way you see the world clearly, despite years of being told you don't matter. I want the woman who dreams of Paris and carries shawls and reads Gothic novels and doesn't simper or flatter or pretend to be something she's not. You barely know me." "Then let me know you better." His voice dropped, becoming almost urgent. "Let me court you properly. Let me show you that not everyone is blind to your worth. Let me dash. Stop." Lavinia held up a hand, feeling panic rise in her throat. "Please, just stop." She turned away from him, hugging herself against a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Behind her, she heard him draw a ragged breath. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I've moved too quickly. I've frightened you." "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "You haven't frightened me. You've—" She spun to face him, surprised to find tears blurring her vision. "Do you know what it's like? To be invisible for so long that you forget what it feels like to be seen. To have people look through you every single day as if you're made of glass. Lavinia? And then you appear. You, with your titles and your wealth and your perfect manners. You ask my opinion. You bring me books. You make me feel like I'm someone who matters or someone worth noticing." A tear spilled down her cheek, and she dashed it away angrily. "But you don't really see me, Alistair. You're bored with society's performances, and I'm novel because I don't perform. But I'm not a novelty. I'm just me, plain, poor, past my prime, with nothing to offer except years of learned invisibility." "Is that what you think?" His voice was raw. "That I'm toying with you? That this is some kind of aristocratic whim? What else could it be?" He moved then, closing the space between them in 2 strides. His hands came up to cup her face, gentle but firm, forcing her to meet his eyes. They were storm grey in the dawn light, fierce with an emotion she didn't dare name. "Let me tell you what I see," he said, each word deliberate and weighted. "I see a woman of extraordinary intelligence who's been told she doesn't matter. I see someone with a kind heart who's been treated with casual cruelty for years. I see resilience and strength and a dry wit that makes me laugh even when I'm certain I've forgotten how. I see someone who dreams of Paris but has never left England, who reads about Gothic heroines escaping impossible circumstances and believes she's only a supporting character in someone else's story." His thumbs brushed away tears she hadn't realised were still falling. "But most of all, Lavinia, I see someone who sees me. Not the Duke, not the title, not the man everyone wants something from. Just me. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How precious?" "You're wrong." Her voice broke on the words. "You're wrong about me. I'm not extraordinary. I'm not. Let me decide what you are to me." His forehead touched hers, and his voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. "I know what it is to be used for a title. After Napoleon fell, when I returned to claim what was left of my family's properties, do you know how many women suddenly found me fascinating? How many men wanted to be my closest friend? They didn't see me. They saw wealth, power, connections. They saw what I could do for them." He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes again. "You asked nothing of me. You didn't even know who I was that first night. And you still spoke to me like I mattered as a person. You have no idea what that meant. What it still means." Lavinia felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd kept locked away for years. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "I'm so afraid of hoping for this and being wrong. Then let me be brave enough for both of us." His hand slid down to capture hers, threading their fingers together. "Give me a chance, Lavinia. Let me court you. Let me show you Paris. Let me prove that this isn't whim or novelty or aristocratic boredom. Let me prove that you're the most remarkable woman I've ever met." She wanted to say yes. God, how she wanted to say yes. But years of learned caution held her back, whispering warnings in her mind. "My aunt will never allow it," she said weakly. "Your aunt has no legal authority over you. You're 9 and 20, old enough to make your own choices." "I have nowhere else to go." "You could come with me." "Not," he added hastily, seeing her expression, "not as anything improper. I have a sister in Bath who would welcome you as a companion. Or I could arrange for you to stay with friends, with chaperones, somewhere you'd be safe and respected while we see where this goes." It was too much, too fast, too overwhelming. Lavinia pulled her hands free and wrapped her arms around herself again, trying to hold together against the storm of emotions threatening to tear her apart. "I need time," she said finally. "I need to think." "Of course." He stepped back immediately, giving her space, though she could see the cost in his expression. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." But he was, of course. 2 days later, Lady Constance informed the household, with poorly concealed glee, that the Duke would be leaving for London at the end of the week. There were estate matters requiring his attention, business at Parliament, a dozen important obligations that had been delayed too long. "Such a shame he's leaving," Lady Constance said at dinner, her smile sharp as knives. "Though I suppose even the most elevated gentlemen tire of country entertainments eventually. One can hardly expect a duke to linger indefinitely." The words were aimed at Lavinia, and they hit their mark perfectly. He was leaving. Of course he was leaving. Men like Alistair didn't stay in places like this, didn't waste time on women like her. She'd been a pleasant diversion, nothing more. She told herself it was better this way, cleaner. Now she could return to her invisible life without the dangerous complication of hope. She told herself this, right up until the moment Lady Constance cornered her in the still-room 2 days before Alistair's planned departure. "I know what you've been doing," her aunt hissed, venom dripping from every word. "Don't think I haven't noticed. You, throwing yourself at the Duke like some common strumpet, making a spectacle, embarrassing this family." "I've done nothing of the sort," Lavinia said quietly, though her heart hammered in her chest. "You've been meeting him, accepting gifts, allowing him to single you out at dinner. Do you think I'm blind?" Lady Constance stepped closer, her face mottled with rage. "You're trying to trap him. A nobody, a spinster with no dowry and no prospects, trying to ensnare one of the most eligible men in England. It's pathetic. It's disgusting." "If you'll excuse me, Aunt, I have work to—" "You'll listen to me." Lady Constance grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise. "I've tolerated your presence in this house out of Christian charity, but my patience has limits. If you continue this shameful pursuit of the Duke, if you continue to embarrass this family, I will turn you out without references and without a penny. Do you understand? You'll end up in the poorhouse, or worse." Lavinia pulled her arm free, her own anger finally rising to meet her aunt's. "And what if he's the one pursuing me? What then?" "Don't be ridiculous." Lady Constance's laugh was ugly. "Men like that don't pursue women like you. He's been kind out of politeness, nothing more. And your delusions about his intentions are making you a laughingstock. Do you know what people are saying? That pathetic old Lavinia Ashford has finally lost her wits, imagining a duke could want her." Each word was designed to cut, and they did. But beneath the pain, Lavinia felt something else rising. A spark of defiance she'd thought long extinguished. "I'll make you a bargain," Lady Constance continued, her voice dropping to something almost pleasant. "Stop this nonsense immediately. Stay away from the Duke for the remainder of his visit. Comport yourself with appropriate humility, and when he leaves, as he will, you may remain here in this house. Otherwise," she shrugged, "well, I'm sure the workhouse is always looking for women of your advanced age." She swept from the room, leaving Lavinia trembling with rage and humiliation and bone-deep fear. Because Lady Constance was right about one thing. Lavinia had nowhere else to go. No money, no references, no means of supporting herself. If her aunt turned her out, she would be destitute. Unless she accepted Alistair's offer. Unless she let him help her, let him court her, let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved something better than this half-life of invisible servitude. But if Lady Constance was also right about his intentions, if he was simply being kind and Lavinia had misread everything, then accepting his help would make her exactly what her aunt claimed, a pathetic spinster desperately clinging to false hope. She couldn't risk it. She couldn't survive that humiliation. So that evening, Lavinia sat at her small desk and penned a note in careful, shaking handwriting. "I'm grateful for your kindness, but I cannot accept your courtship. I'm not the woman you believe me to be. Please don't call it Ashford Manor again. It would be better for everyone if you simply forget we met. L.A." She gave the note to a footman, with instructions to deliver it to the Duke's London residence. Then she went to her room and didn't emerge for 2 days, claiming illness. It was Maggie who found her there 3 days later, red-eyed and hollow. "What in God's name have you done?" her friend demanded, closing the door firmly behind her. "The Duke called on me. Did you know that? showed up at my door looking like someone had gutted him and asking if I knew why you'd suddenly cut him off. What did you do, Lavinia? I ended it. Her voice sounded dead even to her own ears. Before it could become worse. Ended what? The man is in love with you. Don't be absurd. I'm not being absurd, you blind fool. He's in love with you, and you've broken his heart, and your own from the looks of it. Maggie sat on the bed, her expression softening. Tell me, what happened? So Lavinia did. She told her everything. The meeting in the garden, Lady Constance's threats, her own fears and insecurities. When she finished, Maggie was silent for a long moment. So, you're giving up, she said finally. You're choosing your aunt's cruelty and a lifetime of invisibility over even the possibility of happiness. I'm being realistic. You're being a coward. The words were gentle but firm. I love you, Lavinia, but you're letting fear make your decisions. That man came to my house, me, a woman he barely knows, because he's desperate to understand what went wrong. Does that sound like someone who's playing games? Someone who sees you as a novelty? But what if nothing? Maggie grabbed her hands. What if you're right? What if this ends badly? At least you'll have tried. At least you'll have lived. Right now, you're already living the worst-case scenario. You have nothing to lose and everything to gain. My aunt will turn me out. Then let her. Come, stay with me. We'll figure it out together. You're not alone in this, Lavinia, even though that woman has spent years making you feel like you are. Lavinia wanted to believe her, wanted to let hope back in through the cracks in her armour. But fear had its claws in her too deep, and she couldn't seem to shake free. I can't, she whispered. I can't. Maggie sighed, standing. Then I suppose you've made your choice. But know this, that Duke isn't giving up. He told me he's returning to London tomorrow for estate matters, but he'll be back for the Wetherby Ball in 2 weeks. He asked me to tell you that, said he hopes you'll be there, even if you won't speak to him, just so he can see you're all right. After Maggie left, Lavinia lay in her narrow bed and tried not to think about Alistair returning to London, tried not to imagine him moving on with his life and forgetting the strange, invisible woman he'd briefly noticed in a country manor. She tried not to hope. But hope, it seemed, was harder to kill than she'd thought. The Wetherby Ball arrived with the inevitability of spring rain. It was the event of the season, held at the Wetherby estate, a grand affair that attracted everyone of importance within 50 miles. Lady Constance had been in transports of delight when the invitation arrived, already planning which dress each of her daughters would wear, which gentlemen they would dance with, which connections might be forged. Naturally, she had no intention of bringing Lavinia. You're needed at home, she'd said dismissively when Lavinia had dared to ask. Someone must stay to oversee the household in our absence. So Lavinia resigned herself to an evening alone, which was better than being invisible at a ball anyway. She would read, perhaps, or work on the embroidery that was still hopelessly tangled. She would definitely not think about Alistair being at that ball, dancing with beautiful young women who knew how to flirt and simper and catch a duke's attention. She would not think about that at all. But at 4 o'clock, 2 hours before the Ashford carriages were due to depart, Maggie appeared at the door. Get dressed, she commanded, sweeping into Lavinia's room with the force of a small hurricane. The blue silk. No, the green one. Where's your green dress? Maggie, what? We're going to the Wetherby Ball. I'm not invited. That is my aunt. Your aunt can go hang. Lady Wetherby is an old friend of mine. I sent her a note this morning asking if I could bring a companion, and she was delighted to say yes. So, You're coming with me as my guest, and there's not a damn thing Lady Constance can do about it. But, no buts, we're going, and you're going to let that Duke see you looking absolutely magnificent. Now, where's that green dress? An hour later, Lavinia stood in Maggie's carriage wearing a gown she hadn't worn in 3 years, deep emerald silk that brought out the colour of her eyes, and somehow still fit perfectly. Maggie had insisted on dressing her hair properly, pinning it up with pearl combs that caught the light. When Lavinia had looked in the mirror, she'd barely recognised herself. "Stop fidgeting," Maggie said as their carriage joined the line approaching Wetherby House. "You look beautiful. Now, when we arrive, I want you to hold your head high. You're not a servant tonight. You're not invisible. You're my dear friend, and anyone who has a problem with that can answer to me." The ballroom was a blaze of candlelight and colour, filled with the cream of society in their finest. Lavinia felt her courage wavering as they entered, but Maggie's hand on her arm was firm and steady. Lady Constance spotted them immediately. Her face went through several remarkable transformations: surprise, confusion, and finally, pure rage. She started toward them, clearly intending to make a scene, but Maggie smoothly manoeuvred them into a group of her own friends, creating a buffer. "Don't look at her," Maggie murmured. "She has no power here." But Lavinia could feel her aunt's glare like daggers in her back, could hear the whispers starting. "Is that the Ashford spinster? Why is she here? Did you know she's been throwing herself at the Duke? How mortifying!" She wanted to flee, wanted to disappear back into invisibility, where at least she was safe from mockery. Then she saw him. Alistair stood across the ballroom, surrounded by a small crowd of admirers. He wore formal evening clothes that made him look like he'd stepped out of a painting, all elegant lines and aristocratic bearing. A young woman in pink was talking to him animatedly, and he was smiling politely at something she'd said. As Lavinia watched, his gaze drifted away from the woman in pink, scanning the crowd with what looked like boredom. Then he saw her. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, and the world seemed to stop. The noise faded, the people disappeared, and there was only him and her and the space between them that suddenly felt both infinite and impossibly small. He said something to the people around him. She couldn't hear what, and started toward her. Lady Constance intercepted him. Lavinia watched her aunt position herself directly in his path, her smile bright and predatory. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could read Lady Constance's body language, the way she gestured towards someone in the crowd, probably Georgiana or Louisa, the way she touched his arm proprietarily, the way she angled her body to block his view of Lavinia. She was telling him lies, Lavinia realised, telling him that Lavinia was ill or engaged elsewhere or had asked not to be disturbed, telling him anything to keep him away. Alistair listened politely for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he gently but firmly removed Lady Constance's hand from his arm, said something brief, and simply walked around her. He crossed the ballroom with single-minded purpose, and the crowd parted before him like water. People turned to watch. Of course they did. A duke in motion was always a spectacle. And the whispers grew louder. He stopped in front of Lavinia. "You're here," he said, and his voice was rough with relief and something deeper. "I'd hoped, but I wasn't certain. Alistair, She didn't know what to say. All her carefully planned explanations died in her throat. "I received your note." He spoke quietly, but there was steel in his tone. It was very clear, very final, and complete rubbish from beginning to end. You're not the woman I believe you to be? That's what you wrote. So let me tell you who I believe you to be, Lavinia Ashford, and you can tell me if I'm wrong." The ballroom had gone silent. Everyone was watching now, not even pretending otherwise. Lavinia felt her face burning, but Alistair showed no sign of noticing or caring about their audience. I believe you're a woman of extraordinary intelligence who's been treated as if she has none. I believe you're kind despite years of cruelty, strong despite constant dismissal, hopeful despite every reason not to be. I believe you're someone who dreams of seeing the world, but has been told she should be grateful for the small corner she's been given. His voice grew firmer, carrying across the silent ballroom. I believe you're someone who sees people, really sees them, because you know what it's like to be invisible. I believe you're brave enough to laugh at Gothic novels while living in a Gothic nightmare of your own. I believe you're the most remarkable woman I've ever met, and the only one who's ever looked at me and seen a man instead of a title. Lady Constance made a strangled sound. Someone gasped. Lavinia couldn't breathe. So, yes, Alistair continued, his eyes never leaving hers. I know exactly who you are. The question is, do you know who I am? Do you understand that I'm not some bored aristocrat looking for amusement? Do you comprehend that when I say I want to court you, I mean that I want to wake up every morning and think about how to make you smile? That I want to take you to Paris not to be generous, but because I want to see it through your eyes? That I want... His voice broke slightly. He took a breath, steadied himself. That I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel invisible again. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Even the musicians had stopped playing. Lavinia was aware of hundreds of eyes on them, aware of her aunt's fury, and the shock rippling through the crowd, and the fact that this moment would be gossiped about for months. But mostly, she was aware of him. Of the vulnerability in his eyes, the hope and fear warring in his expression, the way his hands were clenched at his sides, as if he was physically restraining himself from reaching for her. I'm afraid, she whispered, knowing everyone could hear but saying it anyway. I'm so afraid. I know. He took one step closer. But I'm here anyway. I came back anyway. I'm standing in front of all these people, making a fool of myself anyway. Because you're worth it, Lavinia. You're worth the risk. Something in her chest cracked open completely, all the locked-away hope pouring out in a flood she couldn't contain. What if I'm not? The words came out broken. What if you're wrong about me? Then let me be wrong. He smiled, and it transformed his entire face. Let me spend years discovering that I was wrong. Let me learn every way I failed to see you clearly. Let me be surprised by you every single day. But give me the chance, Lavinia. Give us the chance. She could feel her aunt's rage from across the room, could feel the weight of society's judgment pressing down on her, could feel every year of invisibility and resignation trying to drag her back into safety and smallness and the life she'd always known. But she could also feel Maggie's hand squeezing hers in support, could feel the possibility of something more, something better, something that terrified her and exhilarated her in equal measure, could feel for the first time in her life that maybe, just maybe, she was the protagonist in her own story after all. Yes, she said, and the word came out stronger than she expected. Yes. The smile that broke across Alistair's face was like sunrise. He closed the remaining distance between them, taking her hands in his, heedless of propriety or the watching crowd. Lavinia Rose Ashford, he said clearly, loudly, making sure everyone in the ballroom could hear, would you do me the extraordinary honour of becoming my wife, of letting me court you properly, and then, if you'll have me, of becoming the Duchess of Valcourt? She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. but for the first time in years, they were good tears. Happy tears. Yes, yes, I will. He lifted her hands to his lips, kissing them both gently. Then, while the ballroom erupted in shocked exclamations and applause, and Lady Constance's cry of outrage, he pulled her into his arms and held her close. "I've got you," he murmured against her hair, so quietly only she could hear. "You're not invisible anymore, Lavinia. You never were. Not to me." And standing there in the middle of a crowded ballroom, held by a man who saw her, really saw her, Lavinia finally let herself believe it. She was visible, she was valued, she was loved. She was, at long last, home. 6 months later, Lavinia stood on a balcony overlooking the Seine, watching the sunset paint Paris in shades of gold and rose. The city was everything the guidebooks had promised, and nothing like she'd imagined, more vibrant, more alive, more beautiful than any description could capture. But mostly, it was Paris with Alistair, which made all the difference. She felt his arm slide around her waist, his chin coming to rest on her shoulder. "Happy?" he asked, though he must have known the answer from her smile. "Obscenely so." She leaned back into his warmth, still marvelling that this was her life now. "Though I think your sister is scandalised by how much time we spend alone together. She keeps reminding me that we have a chateau full of staff who expect to see the Duke and Duchess occasionally." "Let them be scandalised." His lips brushed her temple. "I've spent my entire life performing for other people. I'm rather enjoying being selfish for a change." "Is that what this is?" "Selfishness." "Entirely. You're the most fascinating person I've ever met, and I'm hoarding you like a dragon with treasure." He turned her in his arms so she faced him, his expression softening. "Though, if you want more society, if you want to attend the parties and salons—" "I don't." She touched his face gently, still sometimes amazed that she could. "I spent years being invisible in crowded rooms. I'd much rather be visible to one person who matters than invisible to 1,000 who don't." "You're visible," he promised, pulling her close. "So very visible. I see you, Lavinia. I'll always see you." And kissing him there on that Parisian balcony, while the sun set over the city she'd dreamed of for years, Lavinia finally understood what it meant to be the heroine of her own story. Not rescued by a duke, never that, but seen by a man who valued her exactly as she was, who chose her when the world said she wasn't worth choosing, who made her visible not through his title or wealth, but through the simple act of paying attention. She'd been invisible for so long, but standing in Alistair's arms, with Paris spread below them and a lifetime of being seen stretching ahead, she realised she'd never been absent at all. She'd simply been waiting for someone who knew how to look.